Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm your host, David Myers, and today we're going to talk about technology and the law. Will artificial intelligence take over the world, rendering human beings pawns or victims of technology's unrestrained excesses? How did we get where we are? What constraints can the law provide to the rapid advances of artificial intelligence? And what does the future portend? To help us address some of these questions, we'll be in conversation with John Villasenor, professor of engineering, law, public policy, and management at UCLA, where he co-directs the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Villasenor's work addresses the intersection of technology, law, and policy, with a focus on topics including digital communications, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and privacy. Welcome to Then and Now, John.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you have an unusual background that brings together a number of different disciplines: engineering, technology, law. Tell us how you got to UCLA. You were an engineer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So how did you make your way from there to UCLA, where you're teaching both the School of Engineering and the law school?
Well, it's an interesting backstory. So I was indeed, prior to joining UCLA, I was at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and then I ended up joining the faculty of the engineering school. And back then, this is a long time ago now, we're talking really back in the early 1990s. And back then, my work was solely and only in engineering. And so I had what you might call a fairly traditional early part of my career, going up through the faculty, the progression of professor ranks, and doing a particular type of research, but pretty traditional engineering work. And it wasn't until later that I branched out and started getting involved in some of these other interdisciplinary aspects to the extent that I am now.
How did that happen? Why?
Why? It's a really interesting question. I think I should be clear in stating that I'm no less interested in engineering as a pure discipline in and of itself. I think it's a foundationally important discipline, and I have great respect for it and still have quite a lot of interest in it. At the same time, I also became more and more aware of, or cognizant of, the importance of looking at these technology and engineering related questions, not only in the pure traditional engineering context, but also in terms of their broader implications, the ramifications, the policy implications, the intersection with legal frameworks. And I saw that there was an opportunity to do that. Not that I'm the only one who's ever looked at the tech law intersection. Of course, thousands of people have done that. But more traditionally, the people who do that in academia are people who are coming from the law side. In other words, legal scholars who, as one of their areas of focus, have technology law as an area of specialization, and far fewer people who really came up through the academic training system in engineering, branching out and then actually engaging formally in the legal scholarship in the legal academy on those issues. And so it seemed to me that it was a really good opportunity, and sort of that's what I started emphasizing that aspect of my work as well. And I guess now it's probably close to 15 years ago, and it's been a real learning experience and a growing experience for me, as well as hopefully an opportunity to provide some contributions more broadly.
Maybe by way of framing our discussion about artificial intelligence, you can share with us why law. What were the legal issues? Is this a matter of patent? Is it a matter of regulation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I should just sort of take a step back and say that I didn't originally get into the tech law intersection specifically because of artificial intelligence. I was just more interested in it more broadly, questions of things like cybersecurity and digital privacy and policy around intellectual property. There's just a whole host of areas, some of which have nothing to do with AI, and some of which have come to be very closely related to AI. But when I first started getting involved in this, maybe 15 years ago, AI wasn't nearly as dominant in the public conversation and in the academic conversation as it is today. So my original sort of interest in this was not specifically drawn to AI, if that makes sense.
Okay, so let's jump into the heart of the matter. I'm sure there are many ways to go about this, but how would you define artificial intelligence?
Rather than having me come up with, the 10,000th definition of artificial intelligence, what I thought I might do is read you a one-sentence definition that was codified into federal law. There's something called the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act of 2020, and at least for the purposes of that act, they gave a particularly, I think, a useful definition. They wrote in that law, the term they being Congress, the term artificial intelligence means a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. So I think that's as good a definition as any. I guess I would add to that very often when we talk about AI systems, we talk about systems that learn from and adapt to their environments based on the observations, the data that they're receiving.
So it seems to the uninformed observer that there's been a very considerable acceleration in the development of artificial intelligence over the last few years. I mean, it seems almost month by month there are significant leaps. But obviously, artificial intelligence wasn't born in the 2020s. How do you narrate the history of artificial intelligence?
It's a fascinating history, and I think we can, many observers will go back to the pioneering work of Alan Turing in the UK, who famously published a paper in, I don't remember the precise year, but it was in the mid 20th century, asking the question, can machines think? Which again, today perhaps it's not an earth-shattering question to ask, but it really was a prescient question to ask, back 75 or whatever, however many years it was ago, and that was that paper, as much as anything else, I think you can sort of point to as really an early foundational contribution to what became known as artificial intelligence. And then over the subsequent decades, through really the end of the 20th century, there was significant work, increasing work as the years went on in artificial intelligence. But you're right, and that has continued, but it didn't really explode into the public consciousness until a few years ago. There's a couple of specific reasons for that, but I'll also say that things like ChatGPT, everybody's heard of, but even well before that was released a year and however many months ago it was, AI was already very much in our world, even if we didn't notice it. I mean, for example, 2 years ago, if you got route finding for rideshare apps and purchase recommendations, you were benefiting from artificial intelligence, even if you didn't specifically know that was behind what you were seeing or doing.
So I can think back to something that seems significant in my time, which was when the computer Deep Blue bested the chess master Garry Kasparov.
Yes.
That would seem to be a signal moment in this history. Was it?
Yeah, and it's a great milestone. I think it's also important to mention that as far as I'm aware, the Deep Blue computer did not actually use artificial intelligence. It was programmed, over the course using many, many person years of effort to basically try to capture, the collective knowledge of the programmers and of, what worked and what doesn't, and also just do brute force, sort of, look a certain number of moves forward through brute force and try to figure out what things, what's going to work and what's not. But it was a signal moment in the power of computing to do things that had up until then been associated primarily with human cognition. And even though it wasn't AI as we think of it today, it was just it was still really important. And if I may, I can just sort of contrast that with something that happened 20 years later in 2017. There was a Google computer named AlphaZero, which, starting only with the rules of chess, it got no other information other than the rules of chess, it was able to teach itself to play chess at a world-class level in about 4 hours. And so if you look at that 20-year time span, with Deep Blue, we have world-leading chess, but only at the cost of many person years of development. 20 years later, we have AI being used so a computer can teach itself to play chess in four hours at a world-class level. That's a absolutely stunning set of advances over 20-year time frame.
And for the layperson, can you explain what that advance actually entailed? It had to do with the speed and capacity of something.
Yeah, I think you can, people have been working on AI for, like I said, three-quarters of a century, but of course, over the last, really, over most of that time period, at least the last 50 or 60 years, we've had this exponential increase in computing capacity, and that's both in terms of the speed at which chips can compute things, and also the amount of storage. The price of storage has declined roughly exponentially over that time. And so what I think really created a tipping point for AI in the last decade or so, and even more so in the last few years, is the amount of data and the speed of computers and the low cost of storage all sort of came together, such that you now have truly extraordinary computing and storage capabilities that are accessible to people who are developing these AI systems. And that created this really qualitative leap in what these AI systems can do. I mean, if you look at, people have fun finding errors with ChatGPT, when it creates hallucinations, it makes up facts that aren't real and things like that. But if you take a step back, the things it can do are just remarkable. And of course, that's, it's still early days yet. So I think, as you just suggested, it's really computing power, plus, of course, a lot of people getting very good at creating these algorithms and working on these. It's a combination of the tools that were available and the knowledge of the people using these tools, and those things together is really what has led us to where we are today. And
is this a reality that Alan Turing and his generation imagined to be possible?
Well, that's a good question. I'd say that I would say Alan Turing is not. He's someone in some sense apart from his generation, just because he was so visionary, and I think there were very few people at that time who would have even entertained the question of whether machines can think. But I think that's, someone like Alan Turing, that the very fact that he could ask the question, suggests that he would perhaps be less surprised than others of his time to see what has happened today.
So it's curious to ask what futurists today say of the potential tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'll give an analogy that I think is perhaps useful here. Back in the late 1990s, when the internet was first becoming widely accessible. I mean, the internet itself had been invented, prior to that, but you didn't have browsers on people's desktop computers, at least at large scale, until mid 1990s, late 1990s. And it was clear to me then, if you'd asked me in 1997, 1998, what's the internet going to look like in 25 years or something, I would have accurately been able to tell you, for example, that it was just going to make it a lot easier to find information, right? Just information, the whole cost of finding information was going to just plummet, and the efficiency of finding it. But I would have completely missed social media. Like it wouldn't have occurred to me. I was not able to see in 1997 that the internet, among other things, was going to lead to the creation and rise of social media. And I think it's an important history lesson, at least for me, because it illustrates the difficulty of trying to predict the future. And so I think there's some things about AI that we can say with some high degree of confidence, but technologies have a way of developing in ways that you didn't necessarily originally anticipate. And I think it would be naive at best to suggest that we, sitting here in 2024, can say with any real certainty what AI 30, 40, 50 years is going to look like. I'm just going to be one more kind of analogy or comparison I think is useful. If you go back 50 years, we're in 2024 now, we go back 50 years to 1974, it was no easier in 1974 to predict the technological landscape that we have today than it is today, I think, to predict the technological landscape that we're going to have in 2074. And so if you look at the vast differences we have over the past 50 years, I think it's reasonable to expect the differences will be similar in scope in the next 50 years. And I'm not going to try to predict exactly what form that's going to take, because that's hard.
But is it the case that the pace of change is much more rapid by orders of magnitude?
I don't know if I would say orders of magnitude. I think the pace of change has been pretty fast. I mean, certainly the pace of change of technological change is faster in recent decades than it has been in, say, prior centuries. I don't know that it's faster today than it was in the 1990s. I mean, if you look at the going from 1993 or 4 to 1997 or 8, just a handful of years, web browsers went from, essentially non-existent in a population scale to prevalent, right? And at least in many countries. That's a stunning change. If you go back, not too many years before that, there was a period of time where almost nobody had mobile phones, and over a pretty short period of time, many people, again, especially in some countries, were able to get mobile phones. So there's been, those are incredibly transformative, profound changes, and those were, a quarter century ago. So I don't think the idea of technologically induced sort of profound changes is new. But yeah, things are happening quickly now.
Yeah, and I just think back to the announcement, the first public announcements to the general public of the arrival of ChatGPT. It seemed like there was a lot of conversation about the potential of AI, and then the next moment there was this instrument that everybody could have access to that that was a source of good and not so good, perhaps. But it seemed to come out of nowhere. But I'm sure within the community, it was highly predictable.
I don't know if I'd say predict. I mean, yeah, certainly there's people. Large language models weren't a secret, and neither was the fact that people were, working on interfaces to them. I think what was a surprise to many people, even in the community, was how good these things had gotten. I think that was what was surprising, because it wasn't too long ago where chatbots just, were just vastly less capable.
And what accounts for that?
I think the models are bigger. There's more computation. I think the people behind the best large language models are. I mean, they're extremely. They have a lot of expertise. This is what they do. They're focused on that, and they've really produced some amazing technology.
And as a moral being in the world, how do you find AI when you think of its benefits and its potential productive qualities?
This is not a trendy view to hold in academia, because there's a lot of doomsaying, but I am much more of an optimist than a lot of people. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not that. Be careful. I'm not suggesting that there's never going to be any negative uses of AI. Of course, there will be. I mean, every technology has been exploited by people for negative purposes as well as positive purposes, or almost every technology, right? And so, but I'm not of the view that AI is going to, take over the world, or, make all humans obsolete or control us or anything like that. I think there's just incredible potential. I mean, just one area I'll mention is pharmaceuticals, drug development. The potential for AI to discover new drugs that otherwise would have remained undiscovered for perhaps years, decades, perhaps forever, is truly extraordinary. There's just a long list of applications where the benefits are really, really amazing. There's advantages. There's opportunities to broaden access to legal services, to improve medical diagnostics. I mean, there's just a long list of benefits. And alongside those, of course, yes, there are people who are going to misuse AI for malicious purposes.
And you don't imagine that those efforts will continue. I mean, we saw just in the last week reports that some supporters of the Trump campaign used AI to alter images of Nikki Haley and disseminate them very widely. The capacity to do that kind of thing and promote disinformation seems to be almost limitless. So, yeah. What are the guardrails?
Yes, so I'm not. I want to. I don't know. I haven't read about that specific thing, so I'm not going to comment on that specific allegation. But I will say that the AI, and not only just AI creates the opportunity. It makes it possible to alter images and of course you could alter images before AI, but it makes it more. You can do it in a more realistic way. And people can also create synthetic images that are increasingly going to be difficult to disentangle from the real images. And of course, that kind of technology can be used to really problematic ends. But it can also be used to beneficial ends. I mean, I'll give an example. There was a South Korean presidential candidate who, on his own campaign, recently used AI because he had been apparently criticized for appearing sometimes too cold and unfriendly, and he used AI to kind of modify his video so he appeared more approachable and friendly. I mean, you can have some discussion about whether that's right or wrong, but it's certainly not malicious. It's not evil, right? And it's not something that we would in the United States try to block somebody from doing if somebody tried to do it here. You can also imagine, AI being used in, I don't know, filmmaking, for example, if somebody was going to use AI to make a movie depicting Abraham Lincoln in a completely realistic form, that's another example. But yeah, there are going to be people who use it to create and propagate disinformation, and that is a problem. Although I will say that disinformation has been a big problem even without AI. You don't need AI to have a disinformation problem. There's been more than plenty of that, unfortunately, on the internet for a long time.
So let's turn to the law, where there seems to be a kind of dissonance or anomaly of sorts, insofar as the very people who are producing technological innovations, let's say big tech, are also the people who are called upon to regulate their industries and the internet and presumably the future course of AI. Is that an accurate reading?
I'm going to push back a little bit on that. I mean, the sense that there is government, there's government regulation that's not run by the tech companies that is relevant to AI. In fact, there's quite a lot of it. So it just depends what you mean. Let me just so I don't get taken out of context. People often sort of suggest that, well, there's that we don't have any rules regarding AI. Well, that's not true. And for example, if a bank is using an AI system to make decisions about who to give loans to, and the bank ends up making decisions in a way that disfavors members of protected groups, let's say on the basis of race or gender or religion or something like that, well, that's already unlawful, right? Under the Fair Housing Act, you can't discriminate in home loans, and that prohibition on discrimination isn't any less just because a bank happens to be using AI. So there's a whole set of protections that we already have that will apply to AI if AI is used in a way that contravenes the behavior that those laws are intended to block. So that doesn't question. Does that mean there's not new ways in which AI could be used that are harmful, that fall through the cracks outside the scope of some of these regulations that are already there? That may be the case. And if we identify things like that, well, that is something that we should be looking at carefully in a balanced way about how to address it.
So do you think there is sufficient government regulation at present of the tech industry in general and AI in particular? Like, are we in a good place?
I get hesitant when people just say regulate, and then you just let me give an example. So I think regulation has its role, and I think there may well be a need for additional regulation, but I think it has to be done thoughtfully. Another example I think is helpful to cite is back in 1986, Congress was concerned about digital privacy, and they enacted a law called the Stored Communications Act, which gave substantially more protection for emails stored for less than 6 months than for greater than 6 months. Basically, the law enforcement needed a warrant to get emails stored less than 6 months, and did not need a warrant for emails stored greater than 6 months. And by the way, the law is still on the books. And the logic back then was that, well, nobody stores emails more than 6 months because you'd run out of disk space, right? Now, of course, you fast forward, 40 years, and that same law is on the books. And now what that means is the vast majority of our emails are subject to less protection because of this purportedly privacy-enhancing law. So my point in bringing that analogy is that's a case where Congress said, hey, let's get ahead of this. Let's enact some regulation about this new thing, these electronic things like email. And it ended up actually being counterproductive to doing being in some sense an anti-privacy law, at least through the lens of today's technology. Maybe it was okay the day it was enacted. So I do get nervous about calls for, hey, the logic is we need more regulation. Let's regulate. That to me sounds like a formula for unintended consequences, as contrasted with you say, okay, here's a problem that is attributable to AI, and let's look at all our existing frameworks, legal frameworks, and if we find that none of the existing frameworks can actually address this problem, well, then it makes sense to talk about potential regulatory approaches or other solutions as well. But to have that on the table seems reasonable.
And how would you grade the big tech companies in their own efforts to produce guardrails against excesses and misuse?
I'm not, I guess I don't have enough knowledge about all the, internal steps that they've taken. I mean, tech companies are big targets, and so certainly they have not behaved perfectly. But I also think, there's a lot of political mileage that you can get, members of both parties, can get by sort of bashing big tech because the tall tree catches the wind. And so, again, I'm not suggesting that tech companies have behaved perfectly. And no doubt they have not. But I also think that many of these tech companies do have people who are thinking carefully about some of the ethical implications of the technologies that they're building.
And just thinking of a response to an earlier question, sort of you were identifying yourself as, I guess, if not a doomer, maybe a boomer, as I understand the world is divided. Why should we be sanguine that a group of bad people won't use AI to build a devastating nuclear bomb, or sort of the more sweeping assertion?
Yeah. I mean, there are always going to be people who use the latest technologies in ways that are problematic. I mean, again, history provides a good example, or not a good example, but an illustrative example in a lot of ways on these things. Trying to think of, I mean, so for example, this is a grim example, a terrible example. In World War II, Nazi Germany, their goal was to put a radio, an old-fashioned AM radio, in as many German homes as possible, thereby allowing the government, including Hitler, to sort of speak directly into homes. And that effort, in terms of the effort to distribute radios, was they got radios in a lot of homes, and that's a terrifying use of what was then an emerging technology. But I think the problem was not radio; the problem was the Nazis, right? And so I think we need to, radio, of course, has in the decades since then, it led to many innumerably good uses, right? We would never suggest that there's something inherently evil about radio. The problem is that, like any technology, there are people who will misuse it. I think the same is going to be true for AI. We will be able to find, it's a big world. There's billions of people in the world. Some subset of them are going to try, to use AI for really problematic purposes. And we should be on guard about that, and we should address that. But that doesn't mean that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not the fault of the technology. It's the people who are employing it in these ways. And just as a global ban on radio in the late 1930s would have made no sense, so too would it not make any sense to have a global ban on AI.
And what prevents you from lapsing into the ultimate doomsday scenario of AI taking over the world, the human race?
I think there's any number of reasons why, it depends on AI taking over the world. But I just don't see any system or AI collection of AI systems being so untethered and decoupled from human oversight and control that they could, literally take over the world. Could an AI system do damage? Sure, but I think, as both longer term history and recent history makes clear, I think the greatest damage is done to people. The greatest source of damage for people is, frankly, other people.
Not AI developing decidedly and wholly negative human characteristics like resentment, jealousy, indignation, impulse to violence.
Yeah, I mean, you get into sort of a philosophical question of whether AI has feelings and all these kind of things. So I'm not quite ready to sort of concede that at least today's AI systems have something that we could genuinely analogize or properly analogize to feelings in the human sense. I mean, they're at the end of the day, they're just machines. But even if we got to that point, I would assume that there are going to be guardrails. And again, they're not going to be perfect. I don't. If we over the next decade, will AI in some cases be used for really problematic ends? Of course, but that's also true with the internet, right? There's a ton of, I don't know, financial fraud on the internet, a ton of it, right? There's all sorts of bad stuff that happens on the internet, and we do our best to combat that. We do our best to hold the people who commit those acts accountable, but we don't shut down the internet, right? We understand, I think most of us, that the benefits of having an internet vastly exceed the downsides, even though the downsides are very significant. There's no, I don't want to downplay it, right? If you're a victim of financial fraud, somebody steals your credit card, and they're thousands of miles away, then that's still a big problem. And there's far worse that happens on the internet. But again, it's the people using it, not the medium, that's at fault.
So it sounds like you're not losing sleep at night over fears of what AI might do.
I don't want to I don't want to suggest that I'm sort of whistling. I mean, I have what I would like to believe, and I respect that others may have a different view. I like to believe that, like so many technologies, like the internet, like radio, like mobile phones, that on balance, AI is going to bring us far more benefits than harms. Does that mean we close our eyes and ignore the potential for harms? Absolutely not. We need to be vigilant. We need to think about frameworks for minimizing the probability that those harms are perpetrated, or if they are, for identifying them and stopping them quickly. But I don't subscribe, and I guess you suggested before that there's sort of the doomers and the boomers, but I don't have a binary view. I think I would say that I'm largely optimistic, but also wary and aware of the negative uses. But I don't think that's a reason to turn our eyes away from the really amazing opportunities that we have.
Okay, at that point of cautious optimism, I'd like to thank you, John Villasenor, for taking time out of the schedule.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.